On Tuesday, the 5th of November, Americans will cast their votes to elect the 47th President of the United States of America. It's a neck-and-neck race with no certain outcome just yet, and the world is waiting to obviously see who will lead this last global superpower between 2025 and 2029. Nkanyiso Ngqulunga, legal researcher, social activist, this morning joins us to chat a little bit further as we edge closer to that countdown. Good morning. Thanks for joining us here on the SABC.
Good morning, and thank you for having me.
So the outcomes are not certain at this point. It really is neck on neck. But in relation to South Africa, given the USA's domestic and foreign policy, what would a Trump mean for South Africa? A Trump win mean for South Africa? What would a Harris win mean for South Africa?
Thank you. That's an interesting question because in December, South Africa is taking over the presidency of the G20, and we're hosting the G20. So as we'll be hosting the G20, it is really important on how the Washington is, depending on who wins the elections. But as we know that Donald Trump is a very interesting candidate when it's come to foreign policy because he emphasizes on reciprocity, and he's also a very inward-looking candidate on the foreign policy approach. So I think his demands towards South Africa will always be in line with the bilateral relations that we have with the Americans. For instance, the AGOA it just went under review, and Americans wanted to add more conditions to keep our bilateral relations going on with the Americans. So obviously there's different approaches towards foreign policy to two candidates, although the changes are not big. But we know that Harris is, as she said in the campaign, that she's putting more emphasis into revitalizing the relationship between Africa and American foreign policy, of which has been, in a way, abandoned for a long time. And Donald Trump is a completely different candidate when it's come to Africa. He's not been proactive towards Africa through his term in 2016.
I want to pick up on that because the geopolitical landscape really has shifted since the last time he was in power. And so we're looking at some of the other key issues. We've got Israel-Gaza conflict. You've got the Ukraine-Russia war as well. Talk to us about these dynamics and how they're coming into the mix, particularly with allegiances, but Africa and allies as well.
Yes, I mean, America's attitude towards Africa is not in line with America's strategic interest. So that's why America's foreign policy is not really much of a priority. So that's why this presidential election, how they portend America's foreign policy towards Africa. One, it's all about workers' morality on values. They often emphasize values and human rights when it's come to Africa. So for 60 years, even when we have the relationship with the Americans, it has not translated into better deals, better trade deals, or engagement. It has always been about only when America's interests coincide with those in Africa when it's come to military and counterterrorism. That's the only been the involvement of the Americans when dealing with the Africans. But now we've seen with the geopolitical shift with what's happening in Ukraine and Russia and Palestine and Israel, then that's when the Americans, they could see that there was now because of the global superpower competition, trying to come in now and do something about their relationship with the African countries. And also we've seen a lot of global changes around the global financial architect towards African continent on how they then access the financial assistance from the World Bank and the IMF. I think America now, if you recall, President Biden hosted the African Leaders Summit in December of 2022, where Americans committed $55 billion in infrastructure in the African continent over the years. And he's also supported Africa's security, adding an African country into the UN Security Council. But they said that would be done without a veto power, of which has also caused more debates about America's true intentions of adding the African continent in the security in the UN. And another point was Biden's support of the AU being added into the G20, also expecting that to be deliberated upon next year when South Africa takes over. So it has been a very on and off relationship because since the year 2000, actually, America's trade relationship with Africa has been on a steady decline. And whereas China's trade relationship with Africa has increased fivefold. So, Unpack
that further, just because Africa's also undergone elections, so there's obviously a change of guard, particularly if parties didn't get re-elected. That must also then influence the relationship. And I wonder if we need a reset of Africa-US relations, given what is then unfolding.
Definitely, we do need a reset and refocus Africa's relationship with the Americans. But the problem is, how do you go to Washington and lobby for the trade deals that are favorable to Africans in Washington, where the Americans in Congress and Senate do not believe that Africa is part of their strategic interest in the world, because their main focus is the Middle East, East Asia, and the European allies. So it has not been part of their strategic interest. So that's why it becomes even difficult to lobby in Congress around policies that are going to favor African countries, so that they can be then able to include it in whatever programs and initiatives that American government takes. So the only way in which American government has been participating is through US aid, is through AGOA and other government programs that are like aid or humanitarian aid to support the African countries on the certain front. And also they've been mirrored by a number of challenges with how that aid is administered in the African continent. So even with the political changes around African democracies, there is still a challenge, there's still an impediment on how we are trading with the Americans. So that has opened up a vacuum where we've seen China or Russia's influence is now becoming more and more prevalent because of that vacuum. However, also we've seen where America feels like its interests are important, like we've seen that Angola, President Biden went to visit Angola, because also Angola was the only country that did not visit China during the African summit. So because there was some situation where the Americans felt like there was a security situation that it aligns with their strategic interest at that time. So they needed to protect that. But also to counter the influence as well of China, Americans have used aid, like in Gabon, where they, in the democratic transition, for instance, they offered military training and money to counter the China's possible influence in Gabon during the transitional period.
And I mean, there's a myriad of issues to unpack, because I'm thinking also about the climate change issue, with the Biden administration having to reverse the Trump's decision to leave the Paris Agreement. And so I'm just wondering what the possibilities and probabilities are going to then be on that front if either or candidate comes into the fore.
I mean, with Trump, there's a lot of jittery, not because of an unpredictable situation with him on foreign policy. Right now, all of the policies that have been signed by President Biden on the climate change policies are already operating. So even America's economy. So there is going to be effect even in the African continent. So the whole geopolitical space has been changed financially or otherwise in terms of building infrastructure towards the climate change friendly and green economy. We've seen that with the Inflation Reduction Act and the Clean Energy Act that was signed by the Americans, that's already in place. So although Donald Trump may want to reverse some of those things on climate change or slow them down, but some of them with other American allies, they are already operating. I think even the EU, they've got the CPM that are coming in January of 2026. So it's already in place, and all of the global multilateral institutions are already in line in changing the whole system around climate change policies.
And so it's going to be interesting to see how we utilize the opportunities that come from this next administration, but also the challenges. But more questions and answers at this point. Thank you for your time at this hour. I believe our time is up. Nkanyiso Ngqulunga, a legal researcher, social activist, this morning weighing in ahead of the USA elections. As I mentioned earlier on, it's happening on the 5th of November.